Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Allegro, and on behalf of Liberty Chalkboard, I'd like to welcome you tonight. What is Liberty Chalkboard? Who are they, and what do they do? Liberty Chalkboard is a bunch of concerned citizens. Maybe concerned is an understatement. They're thoroughly disenchanted with the education that their children and their grandchildren are receiving, or as the case may be, not receiving. Liberty Chalkboard's membership consists of former school committee members and elected town officials, scientists, and just regular people who hold that sentiment. I would like to ask the people from Liberty Chalkboard to please stand up as I call your name, and stay standing for a moment, please. We have Agatha Bodwell, Dorothy Cordemange, Mimi Frank, Phyllis Sprout, Pam Vidal, and don't just get up and sit down. Stand up, please, instead. Linda Zern and Marianne Allegro. Liberty Chalkboard concentrated on Common Core since it reared its ugly head a couple of years ago, but prior to that, they were interested in civics and in history education, American history education. And so they produce a variety of pamphlets and other materials, and you'll find some of those on the rear table back there. Feel free to help yourself if you haven't already on the way out. They perform or have other activities as well, because they believe in just regular community and community service. So you'll find the first Friday of every month, we have a free Falmouth movie night. Sometimes the movies are documentary and educational. Sometimes they're just fun. And sometimes we have live performances or other forums like this one. It turns out on Friday, February 6th, I believe it is, the first Friday of February, we're going to have a live performance, a musical history of Louisiana and Mardi Gras by Cajun Bob. So Falmouth Public Library, and if you have given your email address at the back table and would like to receive information about that, we'll send it to you. It's always a good time, a nice bunch of people. So what is the Common Core? And what are your children learning in school? Or what are they not learning in school? Well, you know, I was going to prepare for this a little bit better, and I went to the web because I know there are innumerable examples of the goofy math, the tilted history, and the vacant science that passes for Common Core. But it's too preposterous. You wouldn't even believe half of the things that I showed you or told you. Peg is going to talk about a number of them tonight, I'm sure. Dr. Peg Luksik is a Pennsylvania teacher with over 35 years of experience at every level, from K through 12 on up, preschool, college. She's trained teachers in curriculum and classroom management. This is only a partial list. I don't want to keep going on. She's written and evaluated curricula, authored several books on education issues, hosted a nationally syndicated television program on education, served as an advisor to President Reagan's Commission on the Family, worked for the U.S. Department of Education, don't hold that against her, worked for the U.S. Department of Education reviewing education reform initiatives, and it goes on. Tonight she's going to talk to us about outcome-based education and the Common Core. There are not too many people in the country who know as much or can speak as well to this topic. So she'll tell you what your children are and are not learning, and maybe even why. And I'd like to ask you for a nice round of applause for Dr. Peg Luksik. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. I live in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where it's even colder there than it is here, and we have more snow. So you should feel lucky because you're practically having a heat wave. It was negative 22 when I left this morning. So you guys are balmy. Let me begin with the commercial portion of the program because I always forget. When I'm done these presentations, people always say, you just fed me through a fire hose. I understood it while you said it, but I know I won't remember it. Do you have copies? So there are CD copies, they'll be in the back. There are 4 different ones. The one is called invalid and unreliable. The people who do all the testing, like the PARCC tests, always talk about how the tests are valid and reliable. Those words actually mean something. So I took the definition of valid and reliable and then compared it to the standardized tests. And the standardized tests our children take flunk at every single portion of the definition. So if you want to walk through the testing, pick up invalid and unreliable. The second one is called Should Our Children Be Standardized? This one actually talks about what happens when you move the definition of education from enlightening a child to reaching a standard. And what does that do to classrooms? We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but if you want the real basics of why standards-based education does not and cannot work, you should look at this one. This one also includes the new Advanced Placement U.S. History course curriculum that the College Board has put out. I don't know if you've heard about that. This is the curriculum that they're teaching to the best and brightest of our high school seniors for their AP exam. It's a U.S. history course that doesn't include people like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, and teaches World War II without mentioning Adolf Hitler or the Holocaust. So if you want to know about the new U.S. history, that would be, should our children be standardized? There's also two specific states. One is Pennsylvania, where I live. Pennsylvania was one of the incubator states for the testing, so there's a lot of information on how the tests are put together in the Pennsylvania one. And I also brought New York. New York is a governing state in PARCC just like you, so if you want to see how the things are put together for PARCC, you would get New York. So there's 4 different CDs in the back. I have to pay to make them, so we ask for $10 because I just circle the money around to make more. If we run out, there's envelopes. If you put your name and address on the envelope, put your money inside, you can write a check payable to Founded on Truth if you like. With the titles, I'll mail them to you. So if we run out, you can order them, and when I get home, I'll just mail you from there. So those are available in the back. There's also, I write a weekly blog, and one of them is in the back. Those are free. You can just feel free to pick it up. So that's the commercial portion of our program. What you're going to see tonight is on the screen. The screen is more important than me. So look at, I'm prettier, but look at the screen. The organization is called Founded on Truth. If you go there, there is a weekly blog. It is free, so you just have to sign up. And I write about once a week, and I don't pester people for money. But we give information, updates, ways to argue it, so you can go there and just sign up. There's also other presentations that give you other states and other information. There's actually a button called Common Core. So the organization is called Founded on Truth. All the documents that you are going to see tonight are not written by me. You're going to see grant applications that the state of Massachusetts submitted to the federal government, either to get money or to get relief from regulations. And the reason that I use those documents is the same reason that when you get a loan, you go to the bank and the bank says, so how much money did you make? And you say $10,000, and the bank says, Can I see your IRS tax return? Because you might lie to the bank, but you probably didn't lie to the IRS. Well, similarly, if your Department of Education tells you they're doing X, but they told the U.S. Department of Education in a document signed by your governor and your Secretary of Education that they're doing Y, they're doing Y. Because it's not a crime to lie to you. It is, however, a crime to lie to the federal government. So we're going to look at what your state told the federal government. We're also going to be looking at federal documents, newspaper articles, and research, some conducted actually by the U.S. Department of Education. And you will see the things I'm talking about on the screen so that you can look at the words yourself. And that way you know that I'm telling you the actual information. And he already told you about me. Now this is a long story. We're not going to be here all night. So we're going to start in 1989. In 1989, President George Bush the Elder had a summit meeting with the National Governors Association, who at the time was chaired by a man named William Clinton. And at that meeting, they decided that they were going to change how we do education in America. It was followed first by America 2000, and then when Mr. Clinton became president, by Goals 2000. And Goals 2000 was federal legislation that broke the tradition of local control. It set national education goals and said that the states were going to be held responsible, that all the children would have to meet a certain pre-established standard. At that time, it was called outcome-based education, and a bunch of people like me stepped up to say, no, this is ridiculous, you can't do it. So Goals 2000 didn't have any teeth. The states were told to set standards, but there were no penalties from the feds if you didn't meet them. That changed in 2001 with the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act. No Child Left Behind, the federal government constitutionally has no role in education. If you read the Constitution, you won't see the word education. So how did they get in? They made money available. And the way that they began to make money available was in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson was president, and they passed a piece of legislation called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. If you've been involved in this at all, you hear about ESEA waivers. That's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And what the federal government did was it made boatloads of money available to the states and said, did you want the money? You don't have to have the money. But if you want the money, you have to meet our requirements. So the states volunteered to meet the federal requirements. Now, when the federal government passes a bill that has money attached, it has a shelf life. This much money is available for this much time. At the end of that time, either the money disappears and the mandate's with it, or the federal government steps in and reauthorizes that program by making money available for another period of time again. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been reauthorized a number of times since it was first passed in the 1960s. The 2001 reauthorization was called No Child Left Behind. It was actually a continuation of legislation that was originally passed in the 1960s. What did No Child Left Behind say? It said that the states had to set content standards and achievement standards. What's the difference? Content standards. This is what you will teach. Achievement standards. The children must learn to this level. If I were going to move it to medicine, a content standard would be every doctor would have to give every patient who came to him insulin. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But that's a content standard. An achievement standard. Everybody has to have a blood pressure of at least this number. That sounds ridiculous too, doesn't it? How come when it's medicine we know that you can't make one size fits all, but when it comes to education we forgot that? But attempting to do this in education is as ridiculous as attempting to do it in medicine. But that's the difference. A content standard, the doctor will. Achievement standard, you will have this blood pressure. So in education, the teacher will teach, the child will learn. So the government's attempting to mandate learning by executive fiat. It applied to every public school student in the state. The states were required to set standards in math and reading and eventually science. The standards had to be rigorous, and that's where the word first starts to appear. Now, if you've been involved in the Common Core debate at all, what you hear is the word rigorous all the time. It's always rigorous Common Core standards. It's a marketing word. Kind of like if I say we are farmers, you'll all say bump, ba-dum, bump, 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 bump. Every time Common Core comes into your head, the proponents want the word rigorous to pop into your head as well. Now we're going to look at how they define rigor tonight, but understand the word rigor is a marketing term. The way that the states did it was they had to describe levels of achievement. Advanced was what you think. Proficient, then passing. Basic would be a C- or a D, and then you would just fail. So they measured through a state assessment the levels of achievement. And the states were told that every year, more children have to move into the proficient passing category. And they were given benchmarks. This year, this percentage, and next year, this percentage, and then another percentage. And those benchmarks were called the adequate yearly progress. So when you hear about this, what you hear is the states say, well, they had to make AYP. That was adequate yearly progress. Every year they had to get closer toward all of the children meeting the standards. And No Child Left Behind said the way we measured the standards was every state had to come up with an assessment in math and reading and eventually science that would be given every year, and that would measure whether or not your kids met the standards. And No Child Left Behind said that by the close of the 2013-2014 school year, the one that closed last year, every state had to prove that 100% of the children were proficient in math and reading. 100%. Is that possible? So the states were handed an impossible mandate. In response, what they all did was set the standard in a way that made them able to do it. Let me explain it like this. Stand up. Wiggle while you're out. Exercise is good for you. Okay. This is vocal performance. When you can meet my standard, you can sit down, but you can't sit down until you meet my standard. Are you ready? Luciano Pavarotti. Anybody who can sing like Pavarotti, who was considered one of the greatest tenors of the 20th century, can sit down. Soloist with the New York Met. Chorus member with the New York Met. Soloist with the Regional Symphony. Chorus member with the Regional Symphony. Soloist with the church choir. Sings in the church choir. Sings in the shower and enjoys it. Can't carry a tune in a bucket. Can't find the bucket. Okay. Now, in this system, every state was required to say that everybody met the standard. There was no reward whatsoever for anybody taking one single step beyond the standard. There were, however, extreme punishments if everybody didn't meet the standard. So in vocal performance, where would I set the standard? Well, where did you all sit down? And sings in the shower and enjoys it. I am the teacher in a classroom. In this system, I'm not rewarded at all for anybody going beyond the standard, but I'm punished if everybody doesn't meet the standard. So where am I going to spend all my time? With Mr. Can't Carry a Tune in a Bucket over here, getting him up to sings in the shower and enjoys it. What about Mrs. Can't Find the Bucket? I'm going to ignore her because I'm cutting my losses. And in fact, that's what the research says, that the children at the very bottom are just jettisoned because the teacher's punished if she doesn't get to 100%. She knows she can't, so she's trying to get as close as she can. So the kids at the very bottom get lost, which is why achievement gaps grew. Who else is ignored? The kids at the top. Because the child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti walked into that classroom on the very first day already able to sing in the shower and enjoy it. So that child would pass the test. They met the standard. That child will be ignored. Did education work for that child, or did it fail that child? It failed that child. You can ask me any question you want at the end. Except my weight, which you can ask and I will tell you. It failed that child. And in fact, that's what the research shows as well. That the teachers focus on the children immediately above the standard and immediately below the standard. And they ignore the children at the top and they ignore the children at the bottom because the standard becomes the goal, not enlightening a child. Now the goal is the standard. Was that predicted? Yes, it was, actually. When President Reagan was in office, he actually commissioned a study on education in America, and the commission came up with a report called A Nation at Risk. And in A Nation at Risk, it actually said that this whole minimum competency testing movement is a problem, because they said the minimum becomes the maximum, and education for everybody goes down. And that was in 1983. And yet that's exactly what we're doing here. This is the minimum. So the states were told, you have to have 100% proficiency or you're punished, but you can set proficiency wherever you wanted. So let's look at what your state did and where I'm getting my results. This is right off of your state, spring of 2013 was the last time results were available. They haven't just published the last one yet. And they give you a chart. So in grade 4, in your state assessment in English, your state said that 53% of the kids scored proficient or above. That's pretty good. When those same children took the national assessment, which is not tied to any state, it's funding, they don't have any requirements for adequate yearly progress, they just are an achievement test. When those same children took the national test, 48% were proficient or above. So it's a difference of 5 percentage points. That's actually not too bad. Little lower, but not too bad. Pretty good. Let's move to grade 8. Again, we're looking at your state, the 8th graders who took a reading test, the English Language Arts test in 2013. Your state said 78% of them were proficient or above. That's exciting. When those same children in the same year took the national assessment in what should have been the same subject matter, only 48% of them were proficient or above. Well, that's a difference of 30 points. That's significant. Either you can do English Language Arts at the 8th grade level, or you can't do English Language Arts at the 8th grade level. The tests should have about the same number. The fact that they don't means that this state, like every other state, lowered the bar. We go back to our medical example. Everybody has to have the same blood pressure. I'm the doctor. I will lose my license if all of my patients don't meet the achievement standard for blood pressure. But I can set the blood pressure standard wherever I want. Where am I going to put it? At 340 or 280. Because everybody will meet it. And that's what the states did. They lowered the bar. So that the state assessment said, little Johnny is proficient. But all you got told was that little Johnny was proficient. But what did proficient mean? Well, that was internally set by the same Department of Education whose funding or punishments or incentives were based upon the kids doing well on the test. So they lowered the bar. But when those same children took the national assessment, it was a difference of 30 percentage points. Was that an anomaly? Well, now let's go to high school. We're still in English Language Arts. Your state measures that in grade 10, and by grade 10 in 2013, your state reported that 91% of your high school sophomores were proficient or higher in English Language Arts. The NAEP is not given in grade 10, it is given in grade 12. So I took the 2013 results from grade 12. They won't be the same children, but for comparison purposes, it's still high school. How are we doing? Well, if 91% of your 10th graders were proficient, how come only 43% of your 12th graders were proficient? That's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. Well, what about math? Grade 4 math, your state said 52% were proficient. When those same children in the same year took the NAEP said 58 were proficient. So your state assessment came up with a lower number than the NAEP, which means you set the bar a little higher. That's pretty good. By grade 8, 55% in your state. When those same children in the same year took the NAEP, 55. That's an exact match. And I'm thinking, wow, Massachusetts is doing great. So then I looked at math in grade 10. In grade 10, your state said 80% of your kids were proficient or above in math. In grade 12, when your kids took the NAEP, 34% of them were proficient or above. So I went back and looked at, okay, grade 12, did they include calculus? Did they include trig? Did they include functions? Things that you wouldn't have had in grade 10. So perhaps it wouldn't be an analysis. But the little purple box says no, the NAEP, and I pulled it right off the NAEP website, they test the same thing in all the areas. They test properties and operations, measurement, geometry, data analysis, statistics, probability, and algebra. Those are the exact same topics that they test in grade 4, in grade 8, in grade 12. In other words, they don't add calculus, the things that you wouldn't have before that, or even algebra 2. So you shouldn't see a difference of 80% to 34% between those numbers, which means your state numbers aren't giving you accurate information. In fact, when your state wrote to Washington to get the document behind is what your state sent to Washington to get a flexibility request. Your state told Washington that 4% of the students who score advanced needed remedial courses in public colleges, and 25% of the students who score proficient needed remedial courses in a public college. Now, that's 29% if you put them together. That's not 29% of all the students in Massachusetts. That's 29% of the kids who passed your state test. And it isn't even 29% of the kids who passed the state test, because it says public colleges. So what if they went to MIT, or Harvard, or the University of Pennsylvania? or Notre Dame, or Yale. Well, then that number would be higher, because they're not included in the study. These are only kids who went to like the state university. Well, if they passed your state assessment and said they were proficient at this level, therefore college and career ready, why did nearly a third of them need remediation when they went to college? These are just the kids that passed the test. This isn't all the Massachusetts kids. These are the kids who passed the test. Remember what they said in 1983? The minimum becomes the maximum and education for everyone goes down. Everybody lowers the bar. In fact, in 2008, the National Center for Education Statistics actually took and compared all the state performances with the NAEP. The bars in the back, the brown bar at the top, is the level of achievement you would have to be considered proficient on the NAEP. The blue in the middle is basic. That's a C- to a D on the NAEP. And the light blue means you fail. The little flags are where every state set the bar for proficient on their state assessment. Not one single state matched the NAEP definition of proficient. Only 8 states defined proficient at the place where the NAEP would call it basic. Now, of the states, Massachusetts is the top one. You were the best of all the states. But that's not good. You know, one of my children actually is an opera singer. And when he was in college, he took dance classes because he thought it would make him better. And after 4 semesters, the professor came to him and said, well, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is you're the hardest working student in the class and the most improved. The bad news is you've gone from abysmal to horrendous. Please never take another dance class again. Well, if everybody is abysmal and you're just awful, you're better than everybody else. But that doesn't mean it's good. And unfortunately, because No Child Left Behind moved everybody from a child reaching potential to the purpose of education is meet the minimum standard, the standards went down. And they went down across the country. You went down less than everybody else, but you're still below the NAEP. Not one state met that bar. Nationally, by 2010, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education said nearly 60% of our college students needed remediation when they got to college across the country. 2010. But No Child Left Behind, which was going to hold everybody accountable and move the bar up, that was 2 full cohorts of high school kids who've gone through the system, and now 60% of them need remediation. That was not always the case. When schools actually were locally controlled, our kids did really well. But when we moved from education by teacher to education by bureaucrat, it stopped working. This created a ruckus. Into the gap stepped people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This is actually a grant that the Gates Foundation gave to the James B. Hunt Institute in 2008. It was a grant for $2.2 million. Their budget that year was $2.5 million, so they were very receptive to what the Gates Foundation had to say. And the grant was given to them to move toward the adoption of rigorous, there's that word again, internationally benchmarked standards. So in response, the Hunt Foundation came up with a newsletter. This is the first edition, it was called Blueprint, and it said they were partnering with these organizations to move toward adopting these standards. The Gates Foundation continued to fund the Hunt Institute. You're looking at a list of the grants. From $5.5 million was the biggest, and the smallest was $45,000. The first of them was to rapidly implement the Common Core. So we had No Child Left Behind, we had Goals 2000, which is why all the states set their move to standards-based education. It has never been state-driven. It's always been federally mandated. All the way back in the 1990s, the feds told the states, you have to set standards. It has always come from the federal government. No Child Left Behind put penalties in and timelines in, and it wasn't working. And instead of the response being, well, this is a manufacturing model. Every child's going to meet the same standard. Perhaps we can't apply manufacturing to education. Maybe we should look at this again The response instead was to say, no, we're going to centralize control of the standards rapidly. How quickly can we move to centralize control? So instead of going back and looking at why didn't this work, and maybe we need to think about it again, instead it was more control moving from the local and now from the states up to a central level. In their second edition, the Hunt Foundation said, well, all these groups are expressing support for these standards, and then they list all those groups. So I looked them all up. That's how much money each of the groups received from the Gates Foundation. 25 million, 10 million, 11 million, 37 million, 24 million, 11 million, 4 million. The school principals, their bylaws, they don't receive outside money. 4 million and 11 million. So the Gates Foundation funded the Hunt Institute to say, I think we have to have these standards. Gee, all these organizations are calling for these standards. They were all funded by the Gates Foundation. And then the Gates Foundation gave more money to the Hunt Institute to respond to the Gates Foundation-funded call for standards. It was a marketing circle, and the Gates Foundation funded every step. He has spent over $200 million pushing this. He must think it's a really good idea. He was interviewed at Harvard last year, and what he said was, well, we won't know if this will work for at least a decade. His children go to a school that does not do Common Core. So I was going to ask, well, why is he doing this? This is the Washington Post. It came from the Washington Post. This is Daily Caller, saying that Bill Gates, well, you don't become a philanthropist without first being a business tycoon, and so he's going to make a lot of cash. They've spent over $200 million to promote it. The article goes on to say that they found a webpage on the Gates website saying, well, tech essentials, schools are going to need, with all this computer-aligned tests and everything on computers, they're going to need to spend a bunch of money on Microsoft products. They're going to have the latest, because you can't support it with the old Windows, so you're going to need Windows 8.1, which means you need new monitors to be able to manage the graphics, and you need new headphones, and the memo says, well, of course, anything Mac just wouldn't work. It all has to be Microsoft. And Mr. Gates was asked about it and said, how could you think I did this for money? He's going to make billions in taxpayer dollars. And that's right off of his own website. The Hunt Institute was partnering. One of the partners was Achieve. Achieve is a nonprofit. They received $25 million from Gates, and they said they were going to help to transform this concept of college and career ready from a radical agenda to a national agenda, and that they were doing this at the direction of 48 states. Not one state legislature passed one piece of legislation authorizing Achieve to write standards that would be used for every child in that state. Not one state legislature appropriated one single penny to Achieve for the purpose of writing standards that would be mandatory for every child in that state. This was not led by the states. This was fed to them. After the standards were written and while they were in development, Achieve went around to the states and promoted them, saying, you're going to get federal money if you do this. But no state money was involved in developing it, and no state legislatures authorized it. As a matter of fact, if you've talked to state legislatures, when we began this conversation, most of them went, what? They had no idea that this was happening. So it wasn't at the direction of the states. It was written by two organizations, the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices and the Council of Chief State School Officers. And while the standards were being written, people started to say, who's writing them? And at first they didn't want to say. Then they said on a press release, that's the press release. I just took the words and made them bigger. And they said there was a development work group. There were 29 people. They were not teachers. They were content experts from Achieve itself, from ACT, and from the College Board. They were testing experts. They were policy wonks. And they said that the deliberations would be confidential. That means secret. We don't know who picked the members of the work group. We don't know why they were selected. We have no minutes of their meetings. We don't know why they wrote the standards that they wrote. We don't know what rubrics they used. We don't know why they made any of the selections that they made. Everything that they did was, and to this day remains, confidential. It was secret. The press release went on to say that there would be feedback groups, and when you debate this, you get these lists of, there were all these teachers. The teachers sat on the feedback groups. The feedback groups could ask questions, they could make suggestions, but the press release said the feedback groups, they had no decision making. The work group was the final authority. You know, I have 6 kids. They were all girls except for 5 of them. It's an IQ joke. And every night when they were little, they could ask for a treat. And every night I could say no. I didn't have to give a reason, and my decision was final. The feedback group were the children. The work group were the parents. All the feedback group could do was say please. Finally, there was a validation committee. There were 30 people on the validation committee. In the end, 5 of them refused to sign, and all they did was leave their names off. 2 of the 5 have gone very public. One was Dr. James Milgram, who is a math professor from Stanford University, and one was Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who actually is from right here in Massachusetts. There were other folks who didn't sign. They just chose not to go public. The response was to leave their name off the document, so it would look like it was unanimous. So you didn't know that there were people who refused to sign. And if they didn't go public, you would have never known that they refused to sign. If you look at the Common Core website, you will see that the Common Core standards are copyrighted, which means they couldn't have been developed in a public and open way with your state, because if it's taxpayer funded, it's public. These are copyrighted. You have to use them with a license. And in fact, it says that if you use them, these 2 trade groups have to be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards, unless, the bottom line, if you're a state, you don't have to tell anybody that they were actually written by and owned by these 2 groups. But the website has some other interesting pieces of information. Have you ever bought a car? You know, you can go and buy a brand new car with the 100,000-mile, 10-year, whatever comes first, bumper-to-bumper warranty. Maybe you can't afford that. So you buy a gently used car, like the dealer model, and you get the balance of the manufacturer's warranty. Well, maybe you can't afford that. So you go to a dealer, and you buy a car with a dealer warranty, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, the transmission. Maybe you can't afford that. My youngest son is a junior in college, and this summer he bought his very first car. He's so proud. Spent $850 on this car. You know what the car says on the window, right? As is. In other words, as soon as you sign the paper, it's yours. And if you can't get it off the lot, oh well, not my problem. It is the oldest, most dilapidated car. When you go to the Common Core website, it says that the Common Core standards are provided as is. They don't stand behind the product. In fact, they say that if any injury comes, if a child doesn't learn, if these don't work, they're not liable at all. They don't stand behind their standards as much as Sears stands behind one of their power tools. And that's disturbing. That's disturbing. Did anybody know? Yeah. This is from the Washington Post. It was written by 2 early childhood educators talking about how when the Common Core standards were being written, they looked at all of the panels of people who were supposed to be writing the K through 3 standards, the early childhood standards. None of them was an early childhood professional. A teacher, a child psychologist, a pediatrician. They said, when they looked at, some of these early childhood folks looked at some of the first drafts and said, the people who wrote these standards don't appear to understand anything about how little children learn. They say that the standards are research-based, but if they're provided as is, they can't be research-based. When something is research-based, it looks like this. I do it, and then I send it out to you and you and you and you, and I say, could you use these? And could you let me know, what worked, what didn't, what was good, what was bad? But the Common Core state standards were just plopped down. There's no way for anybody to give feedback, to say this is good or bad. By definition, then it's not research-based because you didn't research it. You didn't ask anybody's opinion. You didn't go to a teacher in a classroom and say, did it work? That would be called research. But there's no opportunity for that. So since there's no loop, there was no beta. If you've ever been involved, the beta is like the first version that you put out to see whatever. There was no beta. They just plopped them in. So their claim that it's research-based is impossible because it's structurally impossible. They didn't test them anywhere. They said that they received 10,000 public comments. They published 24 out of 10,000. They didn't mention that they actually did receive comments. They received a statement that was signed by over 500 early childhood professionals. And the statement said, "We have grave concerns about the core standards for young children. The proposed standards conflict with compelling research in cognitive science, in neuroscience, in child development, and in early childhood education about how children learn, about what they need to learn, and how best to teach them in kindergarten and the early grades." Among the signers were the 3 past presidents of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is considered the foremost authority in early childhood education in America. And their 3 past presidents signed the statement. And 11 copies of it were hand-delivered to the groups writing the Common Core State Standards, and they were ignored. And when the standards were published, Dr. Carla Horowitz, who's from the Yale Child Study Group, said many of our most experienced early childhood teachers are just quitting because these standards will hurt children. And the best teachers won't participate in it. Now, it wasn't just the marketing side. The federal government got involved. And when Mr. Obama first became president, you remember, the stimulus bill was passed. Inside the stimulus was a $53.6 billion appropriation to the U.S. Department of Education. It was called the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. Inside that was Race to the Top. That was just a $4.35 billion out of that bigger package. In order to get the $53 billion, the states had to say that they would do 2 things. They would move toward the rigorous college and career ready standards, and they would put together a pre-K to college and career database. Now, I was one of the people who used to read grants that people submitted. If they wanted money from the federal government, the feds put out, you write a grant. When you read hundreds and hundreds of them, it's easier if they all look the same. So you get a packet, if you're the state, from the feds. And if they really want you to do it, they write the words that they really want you to do. And then you just have to sign it, so that the states can't do airy-fairy language. They want you, we want you to promise you're going to do this. And it's called an assurances page. So in the stimulus grant, the assurance was that the state would establish a data system that conformed with the America Competes Act. That's federal legislation. So the data system has been mandated by the federal government from the beginning. And the feds actually had training sessions for the state. These were the handouts. SLDS, State Longitudinal Data System. And what they said was that the data systems have to include early childhood information, post-secondary information, and labor data. It was called a P through 20 system. P being preschool, K through 12 being what you think. 13, 14, 15, 16 was college. 17, 18, 19, 20 is the rest of your life. So it was a cradle to career data system. It had to connect teachers and students. Why? Because in the past, when the feds tried to do things, teachers went, that's very cute, closed their doors and did what worked. So now we can make sure that we can track the teachers. We hold teachers accountable. How did the kids do on the tests? We can find out how well, if these children are in Mrs. Blankenschmiel's class, how often did Mrs. Blankenschmiel use the state model curriculum on the website? And then how do our kids do in the tests? So it's a way to hold the teachers accountable as well, which makes it harder for the teachers to refuse to comply. The data has to be made available to the research community and to public stakeholders. Who's a public stakeholder? Anyone who has a legitimate educational interest. The federal legislation is called the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. FERPA is the acronym. The Obama administration rewrote the regulations around FERPA to say if you have a legitimate educational interest, you can have access. That includes vendors. How do I know you have a legitimate educational interest? You just have to fill out a form and tell me that you do. Nobody checks. The data has to be able to cross state lines. Now, if you know anything about programming, when you have a data system, the words aren't really the important thing, it's the code that matters. The only way it can cross state lines is if everybody uses the same code, which means there is one data system, and every state is implementing it. But the codes are the same in every state. If they were not the same, you couldn't cross state lines. What are the elements? Again, mandated by the America Competes Act. If you look at number 1 and number 7, enrollment information and transcript information. That sounds really innocuous until you think of all the things you tell your school when you enroll your child and all the things that are in a transcript. They know your family structure. Who does this child live with? Who's in the house? They have your health records because you have to give vaccination records. If there's a school lunch program, they may ask for your IRS tax returns. So now they have your financial records. Transcript information includes disciplinary records. In Pennsylvania, last school year, we had a 7-year-old who was eating a Pop-Tart. And as he took a little bite of the Pop-Tart, he said to the teacher, "Wow, don't you think this looks like a mountain?" And she said, "No, I think it looks like a gun." And she suspended him because it was a very dangerous Pop-Tart. You understand, it was probably strawberry. He was suspended. So his record says terroristic threats. He was 7, and he was eating a Pop-Tart. But his transcript now includes a suspension for terroristic threats. That's in a database. So is that a problem? Yes, it is. If we think back to when we were kids, you know, there's lots of things I did when I was 7 and 8 that I really would rather not have the world know. And I'm sure you did too. And children who come from troubled backgrounds are more likely to have had some of those things occur. But if they turn it around, shouldn't they be able to leave that behind? Well, isn't it interesting that if you break a law, the criminal justice system seals your records at the age of 18. But if it's in the school database, it's not sealed. So your children don't have the same rights as felons. That's a problem. Every child has an identifying number. State assessment scores are included. The data is audited. There's a number on the teachers. Here's the P through 20 system. Again, this is the federal document. The little box on the top that says fiscal year 6 and 7, that was the original, was K through 12 information. The box in the middle was when they began in 2009, they added post-secondary early education and began collecting data on teachers and staff. And then with this stimulus money, you have the big box. So if you read along the bottom, there's your labor data, English language learners, there's your financial records and your health records, and we can go from state to state. In Tennessee, they actually call it a 360-degree picture of the child. That's what they call the database. Massachusetts received $994 million in stabilization money. So did you do a database? Yes, you did. Additionally, Massachusetts is this is your memorandum of understanding with the park assessment. You are a governing state. To do that, you had to sign a memorandum of understanding, and the park assessment is federally funded, and this is part of the grant that they receive from federal funding. In order to be a governing state, you had to do statewide implementation, you had to use all of the results, you had to participate fully in the program. Here's Park's website that you are, in fact, a governing state. In your state, Park, so everything Park does, you do. Park is federally funded. This is the agreement between Park and the U.S. Department of Education. And in the agreement, Park says they'll work with the department to develop a strategy to make student-level data that result from the assessment system available on an ongoing basis for research. Look at the bottom. Producing student-level data in a manner consistent with an industry-recognized, open, licensed interoperability standard that is approved by the department. So, your state contracts with Park, Park contracts with the federal government. In response to the contract, the federal government gets student-level data. Those are your students in the federal database. Your state additionally applied for and received Race to the Top money. This is the application that you signed. It was signed by your governor and your chief state school officer and the president of your state board of education. It was signed in May of 2010. Now, just as an aside, you see that it was signed in May of 2010. In the park application, you agreed to do the Common Core state standards, which were published in June of 2010. So you agreed to implement standards that nobody had seen yet. That's not very responsible. This is a very odd grant application. Now, when I told you when I worked for the department, I used to read these ad nauseum. The first line in it that says, to the best of my knowledge and belief, all of the information is true. That's kind of what it says on your IRS tax return. Okay. The next line, I further certify that I have read the application. I am fully committed to it and I will support its implementation. That is highly unusual. Generally speaking, when a state applies to the feds for a grant, it's assumed that if I don't get the money, I'm not doing it. But when they sent this grant in, the governor had to sign, as well as your chief state school officer, that he had read this and that he was going to do it. It doesn't say if I get the money. They had a promise to do it, to be eligible for the funding. That's very unusual. It's a much higher standard and a very unusual one for the feds to implement. So you sent this application, and this is your phase 2 application, and you in fact did get money. And in the application, the data systems were addressed. So your state told Washington that Massachusetts has developed data collection and implemented an education data warehouse that will address all of those elements. Remember those 12 essential elements that we saw? So your state said you have a statewide student identifier. You started in 1998. You have student-level demographic and program participation data. You have student-level information on a P through 16. That's preschool through college. Enrollment, dropout, transfer, and graduation. You told the feds that you could communicate with higher education, that you audited it, that you had individual student test records, that if a student wasn't tested, you still were collecting information on that child, that every teacher has an identification, you have all the transcript information is collected. You have college readiness test scores, how they transition, that you can move it back and forth. So you told Washington you have all 12 of the elements in your state data system. You also said that you were adding, back in 2010, all the student discipline data was being added to the database. You said that you would make your data available to researchers. In fact, your state told Washington that you had a robust system already for sharing confidential student-level data with researchers. I bet you didn't know that. You also applied for flexibility, meaning you reached for the money of Race to the Top. Remember No Child Left Behind said 100% proficiency? Well, the states were like, we can't do that. So the feds said, okay, well, we'll give you flexibility on that 100%, but you have to apply for it, which means you have to jump through more hoops. This is your application for your flexibility. This was the one that was approved. It was just renewed in October of 2014. And in your application, you said that the education agencies are now having a streamlined P through 20 data system, that you could make the data flow back and forth, and if you got funding, you would develop a kindergarten readiness assessment. You got the funding. Here's your Massachusetts kindergarten entry assessment. Now these are before the little ones get to kindergarten. It goes from birth to grade 3. It measures growth and learning across all developmental domains during the child's kindergarten years. This is right off of your state's website. The teachers are the ones who do the observation and collect the information. Now I have to tell you, when I was in grad school, part of what I did, because I have a degree in special ed, so I worked as a teaching assistant in the university that I went to had a testing clinic, for IEPs and stuff. So I was the grad assistant that helped with the psychometric testing. It is incredibly difficult to assess a small child. Did you ever see the movie Up with the dog? He starts talking squirrel. Well, that's a 5-year-old. That's how 5-year-olds are. So they have a very short attention span. They're easily distracted. They jump all over the place. So it's very difficult to accurately assess a 5-year-old. Plus, little boys don't mature at the same rate as little girls. You have boys and girls. Did you ever watch little boys and little girls play when they're little? Little girls sit down and play dolls and they talk, and little boys kill each other in the other room. That's just what they do. So their fine motor skills don't develop at the same pace. They get to the same place, but they get there later. That's just the way it is. So little boys will test slower. But that's not a measure of their intelligence or their ability. That's just developmental. Children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who don't have the same experiences often test slower, but it's false. You know, if you've never seen a cow, or read a book about a cow, and somebody says, "What's a cow?" you won't know. But that doesn't mean that you have an intelligence problem. It's an environmental thing. So there's all kind of issues that work around little children, especially in assessment. But in this system, you're having these kindergarten and sometimes preschool workers assess these kids. My granddaughter is 2. And the daycare center, before her 2nd birthday, sent home to my son and his wife saying they wanted to assess. And he called and I said, "Why would you assess a 1-year-old? Unless you have somebody who's really good at it, the results are going to be totally wrong. Mostly you're assessing how compliant they are, which is not at all a measure of any of these things. But these are not trained psychometricians. These are kindergarten teachers. And their observations are going into the data system. And they're assessing social, emotional, physical, language, cognition, literacy, math, science, social studies, the arts, English language. Can you imagine if we had used this system with Dr. Ben Carson? You know, who grew up in the slums of Chicago and is now an internationally recognized neurosurgeon? He would have never passed in kindergarten. The assessment tools, as we go through, they're online. We're capturing the information, so it's part of that, remember, P through 20, so now it's in the data system. And we're measuring, as we said, social emotional development, that's self-concept and self-control and cooperation. Approaches to learning, are they curious, are they engaged? Language development, literacy. This is pre-kindergarten. Math, science, creative arts, physical health. And if you look at the very bottom, where's this coming from? Pearson. Pearson is a British, they're based in the United Kingdom, they're the publishing house. As a matter of fact, they have the contract to do the PARC assessments as well, and they do a lot of the curriculum for Common Core, and that's who's developing the assessment system. The other one is pure teacher observation. So you did get, and now you did the money to do the pre-kindergarten assessment, so now your database at the preschool level is more robust. Well, what about at the adult level? It's interesting, where you find the adult connection to this data system is not in the Department of Education, it's in the United States Department of Labor. And it's called the Workforce Data Quality Initiative. And right off the website it says it supports the development of or enhancements to longitudinal databases that integrate workforce data and create linkages to education data. The states will incorporate this information into longitudinal data system, and the goal is to use the systems to follow individuals through school and into and through their work life. Main objectives: enable workforce data to be matched with education data to create longitudinal data systems with individual level information, beginning with pre-kindergarten, through post-secondary schooling, all the way through entry and sustained participation in the workforce and in employment services. So it's a dossier for every single person. And here's Massachusetts' Workforce Data Quality Initiative grant. So your state got money to do that. Now let's go back to our federal requirements to get the federal money. Remember, we just looked at the databases. We're back to our assurance page. And the second thing you had to assure was that you would implement the standards. Again, the feds held workshops. These are the handouts. And what they said was, this is cradle to career education. The purpose of education is to prepare a workforce. So everything is designed to move people into the workforce. And the way that we do that is, well, we start with the standards and we have assessments. And when you debate this, what you often hear is, these are just standards. These have nothing to do with curriculum. You can do whatever you want with curriculum. That is educational poppycock. Standards that don't have curriculum attached are not worth the paper that they're written on. If the standard is everybody has to learn their times tables and you walk into my classroom, what am I going to be teaching? Times tables. And if I control the test, and the test is high stakes, then I control everything. The standard is, you have to make a chocolate cake that tastes just like my chocolate cake and has the same texture as my chocolate cake. You see my cake? 3 layers, chocolate icing, sprinkles. It's a really good cake. And the assessment is, I'm coming to taste your cake. How many recipes can there be? 1. Because if you change anything, it won't taste like my cake. If I control the standard and I control the test, I control the curriculum. And the federal government told the states that all the way back in 2009. You have to align your instruction to meet the standards and pass the test. So, is this really a good system? I mean, are these like amazing? While the standards were being written, this is from the National Association of Math Educators. William McCallum was one of the folks that we looked at in that press release. He was one of the 29 writers. And he actually attended a national conference of math educators with a draft version, and they hated the standards. They said they were too hard in the early grades, they were poorly written, they were too bureaucratic, and why are we in such a rush? And he said, well, the timetable is federally driven because the states are using race to the top money, the feds are using race to the top money to force the states to adopt the standards, and the article actually says sight unseen. But he said, don't worry, because the standards won't be too high, especially in comparison with other nations. Well, maybe he was wrong. Now, Trevor Packer, who is the Senior Vice President of the College Board, why does that matter? The architect of the Common Core Standards is a man named David Coleman. He is nationally recognized and often called the architect of the standards. Interesting fact, Mr. Coleman attempted to get a job teaching in the New York City public school system, and they declined to hire him. So this is a man who never taught. After he worked with Mr. Gates for the funding and helped develop the standards, he moved to the College Board. And he is now the president of the College Board. So Mr. Packer works for the architect of the Common Core Standards. And Mr. Packer attended the national meeting of the American Association of School Superintendents, and they asked about the standards, and he said calculus sits outside the Common Core. Common Core asked that educators slow down the math progression. The National Center for Education and the Economy, their federal think tank, as a matter of fact, Mr. Tucker is an advisor to the U.S. Department of Education on implementing this, in May of 2013 put out a document called What Does It Really Mean to Be College and Work Ready? It means to be ready to go to a community college. Specifically, that means middle school math and Algebra 1 by the end of your sophomore year in high school. Because he said most community colleges start with Algebra 1, so why would you need to learn Algebra 2 in high school to go to college and take Algebra 1? That document says only 5% of the careers out there require Algebra 2 or more. I'm not sure what planet he lives on, because one of my sons is an engineer, and he used to be a teaching assistant while he was in college, and he taught math, and he said they now have a cap for nurses course. Because of all the nuclear medicine, the nurses have to be able to find limits. So now they have a calculus for nurses. But only 5% of the careers, he says, require more than Algebra 2. So it's a waste to teach it. The document recognized that the standards were very low. Did anybody listen to that? Well, remember, you're a park state. So the park assessment says that the assessments will be based on the Common Core standards, and they give you content frameworks. This is what you should teach at what level in order to pass our assessments. By grade 4, you have to be able to add and subtract using a standard algorithm. That's write the problem down and solve it. Before Common Core, that was grade 2. By grade 6, you have to be able to do long division. That used to be grade 4. Except that, starting in grade 6, you can use a calculator when you take the assessment. So you don't really have to learn how to do it at all. You just have to be able to push the buttons. Is that a good idea? Maybe we don't need all that math. You know, the US Department of Education actually does study education. In 1999, they published a document called Answers in the Toolbox. What they looked at was what in high school, like what should we be doing to give our kids the greatest shot at success in post-secondary education. And what they found was that if you get to math beyond Algebra 2, you more than double your chances that you'll enter post-secondary education and get the bachelor's degree. Anything beyond Algebra 2. But if we take Algebra 1 by the end of our sophomore year, that puts geometry in your junior year and Algebra 2 in your senior year. In Pennsylvania, I actually debated the Pennsylvania Secretary of Education. There were 3 people on her side and 3 on mine, and one of her folks said, "Peg, this is not lowering the standards. You can still take AP Algebra 2. And I looked at the secretary like, are you going to correct him? Because right now, if kids are taking Algebra 2 in college, it's not an AP course. It's remedial. So this isn't moving the bar up, it's moving the definition of success down. That study became the basis of a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is where a researcher, instead of going out and doing a new study, they look at all the studies that have already been done to see if they can find trends. Do we have agreement? Can we come to conclusions? Was this study an anomaly? Auburn University did a meta on what constitutes success in college. They looked at 25 years worth of research, which is really quite large. And what they said was, as secondary math went up, the likelihood of success in college did too. In fact, kids who get to calculus were 28 times. I didn't say 28%. I said 28 times. That's 2,800%. More likely, not just to finish college, but to be a high achiever. Regardless of their race, their socioeconomic status, the kind of high school they went to, or the major that they take. Because the skills of higher math, thinking logically, organizing yourself, perseverance, translate. Now, does that mean every child should go to college? No. Does that mean every child should take calculus? No. But it does mean that we should be setting educational policy that is designed to give every child the possibility to get as far as they can in math, so we open every door for them in college. But this system is closing the doors that we should be opening. It's exactly backwards. How is it that the US Department of Education in 2014 doesn't know what they did know in 1999? That higher math is good for our kids, no matter what major they take. It's exactly backwards. Is English any better? Nope. I actually attended a training session, I've attended several, for Common Core. This is one of the handouts. It's called close reading, where you're supposed to look at the text and not anything else. And the example that was given in the handout was the Gettysburg Address. And it says you're not supposed to ask the kids why the North and the South were fighting. You're not supposed to ask them if they've ever been to a funeral. You're not supposed to ask them if equality is something worth fighting for. You're only supposed to talk about the words of the Gettysburg Address. Which is sort of ironic because the Gettysburg Address says the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. But they're not supposed to talk about what they did. They're only supposed to talk about what they said. Close reading, no outside sources, only what's in the paper. This is a 12th grade Common Core literature book, and actually I brought it because I bought it, it's mine. It's multiple volumes. I only carry one because it's heavy. It's Pearson, largest publisher. This is the 12th grade book, and it's the Common Core edition. It says right on the top. And on the very first page of the kids' book, the first thing they tell the kids is that every selection available in the book is available in audio format online. And then they tell them there's an audio summary, an audio Cliff Notes version. So the first thing they tell these 17-year-olds is you don't have to read a single word in this book, and you don't even have to really listen to Shakespeare because we'll give you an audio Cliff Notes. Now, if we're honest, we all read Cliff Notes. But what good teachers did was we'd come up with activities and stuff that you couldn't actually do it unless I did want you to read Shakespeare. So I made it so you had to actually read the document. But the first thing they're telling our 17-year-olds is you don't have to read the book. You can listen. And if you don't actually want to listen, we'll give you a summary. So I read through the book. The book describes antonyms as words that are different in meaning, not opposite, and the example was admonish and calm. It talked about the Canterbury Tales and how it was a frame story. A frame story is a story within a story, like a picture in a frame. So in the Canterbury Tales, the journey of the pilgrims is the frame, and then the picture inside is each of the little stories that they tell. So they asked the students to come up with other examples of a frame story, and the example that they give is the Christmas story, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, because there was a snowman. The snowman didn't have a story. There was no frame. The snowman was the narrator. But if you think about that Christmas special, there's no story about the snowman. So it's not even structurally correct. They talked to the children about, in medieval England, well, the women didn't learn to read and write. That's true. Neither did the men. But they don't tell them that. So that's a political point of view. The statement itself was true, but they didn't tell the whole truth. They skewed it to give a political point of view. In one of the units, it's how 19th century literature is interpreted in 20th century America. And so the example is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And they read an excerpt from the person who wrote this book. They read an excerpt from what Mary Shelley thought while she was writing Frankenstein. And then they read a Saturday Night Live skit about Frankenstein. What do they not read? Frankenstein. So I don't know how you can interpret how Frankenstein is interpreted if you never read it, but they don't read it. And the enrichment activities, remembering that these are 12th graders, are things like have them dress up in costumes. That's the enrichment. So pedagogically, this is not a good book. And then you have the threads through of political agendas. In the Park assessment, in the writing section, the kids are allowed to use a spell checker. So they don't have to be able to spell. They can use the correction on the computer. It's not just in the schools. This is the GED test that's been changed to be Common Core compliant. The kids get a source text and then a writing prompt, and they're graded on the complexity of their answer. How well do you use the information in the source text? So the source text on global warming says that temperatures are increasing because of population growth and human industrial activity. The students are then asked to write an essay with a correct explanation of how human activity has directly contributed to the rise in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, global warming is the source of one of the most heated political debates and scientific debates in America today. Scientists are all over the place on whether it exists and who caused it and why. This is one point of view. What if the child doesn't agree with that point of view? They're going to get a lower score. But this is a writing test. Nobody knows that they were scoring a political point of view. And the GED test is used to determine whether or not you graduate from high school and what college you get into, if any, and what kind of a scholarship you get, if any. So we're sorting based on politics. This is in the social studies, and the source text talked about whether or not foreign aid really helped, and in the article they talked about foreign aid to Afghanistan and how we didn't give enough. And this is in fact what happened on 9/11 when terrorists from Afghanistan hijacked planes and carried out attacks on the United States. They were not Afghans. They were Saudis, and they weren't poor. So it's not even accurate information that we're giving. And based on that, the kids were told, should rich countries continue to give aid to poor countries or should they stop? Now understand, when a student is in a testing environment, and you say, here's the source text, and you have to write about this, whatever you put in the source text, they're going to swallow. They don't evaluate it. All the screens are gone. Because they're busy trying to pass the test. So later on, it's, I read this somewhere, even if it's perfectly false. There's no screen in there. So what you give them in the source text, if it's not accurate, they're going to swallow it anyway. They're going to swallow it anyway. Mr. Coleman, who moved from the writing the Common Core to the SAT, said they're going to change the SAT to be Common Core compliant, and in fact, the SAT that will be given next year will be this new one. And what they did was, they returned to the 1600-point scale, they took out the essay, they eliminated vocabulary, because he said, since we're not reading literature anymore, like we're just reading informational texts, and it's much more abbreviated in terms of the literature they read, we don't need those obscure words. We only need words that are necessary for college and career. They dropped whole sections of the math. Well, of course, they slowed the math down. So they took out the pieces of the math that the kids are no longer learning. So the scores will stay high. This isn't measuring the student against the standard. It's measuring the standard against the student and lowering the bar so everyone will think that the kids are still doing just as well. Now, if our kids actually did read literature, this would sound eerily familiar. It's from 1984. In 1984, Winston rebels against Big Brother, is eventually caught, and in his re-education, O'Brien, who is his interrogator, says, don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we'll make thought crime literally impossible because there won't be any words with which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out. Every year there will be fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we're having right now? This year, the National Learning Network reported that the average reading level of our college freshmen in America is 7th grade. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston? Now I always like to end with good news. This is my granddaughter. She's 2. Why did I show her to you? Well, she's adorable. But every one of you has a face that looks just like that in your life. That when you see that face, your heart just sinks. You smile when you just think about them. In Pennsylvania, in front of our education committee, the Department of Education and the state board came to testify in favor of Common Core, and they called the children widgets. And in their example, they said, it's like making widgets. And they went on to say, if you buy a hamburger in the McDonald's in one city, and then you buy a hamburger in a McDonald's in another city, the hamburgers are the same. So why can't the products of our schools be the same? When did our children move from the clients of education to the products of education? Does anybody think that what they do to the ground meat at McDonald's is for the benefit of the hamburger? If our children are the products, who's the client? And when did that change? You do something to a product for a client. Common Core, that isn't something we're doing for our children, it's something we're doing to them. People ask, why do you travel? Why do you do this? Because when I look at that face, I don't see a widget. I see something amazing. And if to protect her, I have to get all of you to protect that face in your life, that's fine. I could ask, well, can we win? It's such a big government, can we win? It's amazing to me when I travel the country how many women are standing up about this. It's been said that fathers will die for their children, and God love you, gentlemen. That's true. Mothers will kill. There is never going to be a time when the moms and grandmoms of America are going to say, oh, that's okay, you can have them. Not going to happen. When the federal government decided to declare war on the children of America, they forgot that all those children had people like me, you, and you attached. And we're not giving them away. The only question is, how long will it take us to win? Well, that depends entirely on you. The worst thing you can do tonight is nothing. You say, oh, Peg, that was amazing. I'm so glad you're out there doing that. I'm going to go home and watch television. It almost doesn't matter what you do. Do something. Start with your own children. If you can pull them out of the public schools, do it tomorrow. Because they're battlegrounds, and we don't fight battles with children. So if you can remove them, remove them. But that doesn't mean you're not fighting. I mean, she's 2 and the rest of mine are grown. But the public schools of America were the instrument that made us different. Because public education said your past did not have to determine your future. It said, we're going to reach out and give everybody a shot. You don't have to be just the rich, just the elite. Everybody should be able to learn to read and write. Everybody should have the chance to build tomorrow. So our public schools are worth fighting for. So protect your own children, but then go in and fight for everybody else's. If you can pull them out, make sure your kids learn to read and write and count. Look for non-common core math. Look for reading programs that are phonetically, teach phonics. Make sure they learn about the history of this country. If you're a grandparent, instead of buying a doll or a G.I. Joe, offer to pay tuition at a private school. Offer to pay a tutor. If you're a retired teacher, call the homeschooling network in your state or a private school and say, you know, I can help. I'm a retired engineer. I'm a retired mathematician. I'm a retired physicist. I'm a retired nurse. Because a lot of the reasons that parents are afraid is they think I can't teach it. But most of the state homeschool programs, if they have networks, they'll use you. So volunteer. Talk to your elected representatives. Here in Massachusetts, you can have your school committees pull out of the park tests. So they need to hear from you. That's not true in every state. You have some amazing options here that other states don't have. Use them. Make sure your school committees hear from you. Make sure your state legislatures, there's bills that are being introduced here in Massachusetts to study, to slow it down, that we can't move forward till we implement the cost. Those are all good measures. Make sure your state representatives and your state senators hear from you. Handwritten letters, visit them in their home district office. Take a friend. Follow up with a phone call. Make sure your governor hears from you. In the end, this is a federal issue, because the federal government is bullying the states. So you have congressmen and U.S. senators. Tell them it's time to get the bureaucrats out of the classrooms. You know, there's a time and a place for politics. Kindergarten classrooms aren't it. So tell the federal government to go home. Get their fingers off our children. They don't belong to Washington. They belong to us. Write letters to the editor. Put a bumper sticker on your car. Put a Stop Common Core sign. Make sure you walk out with at least one video and then have a party in your house. Make coffee cake. Food is good. Donuts are wonderful. And show it. Get involved with groups like the Liberty Chalkboard. Make sure you sign up. When we fought it in the 90s, when it was called outcome-based education, everybody said we couldn't win. And we did. We beat them. We beat them. This is an amazing country. The people actually can tell the government no. You know, I worked in the Reagan administration, and President Reagan is famous for saying, freedom isn't something you can take for granted. We don't pass it through our bloodstream. We're only ever one generation away from tyranny. We have to protect freedom. We have to preserve it. We have to fight for it. We have to teach it to our children. Because if we don't, we might be the generation that has to tell our children or our children's children about a United States where people used to be free. I have no intention of ever having to say those words to my precious little granddaughter. And I beg you to join me in protecting your children and your grandchildren's freedom as well. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a question and answer period. I want to say a word or two and then turn it back over to Dr. Luksik. I also want to take this opportunity to cover a couple of things that I missed at the very beginning in opening comments. In the back of the room, there's a table with representatives from New Testament School, including the principal, Mr. Rodriguez. There are representatives from homeschool groups. Again, there's the table from Liberty Chalkboard. And there's a donation basket for Liberty Chalkboard. You can help by throwing a buck or two into that basket. It helps support events like this. I want to acknowledge the presence of a couple of people in this room. I saw County Commissioner Leo Cacunas. I see Board of Selectman Linda Zern. Do we have any school committee members in the audience? Thank you. And now here's the million-dollar question. Are there any state legislators in the audience? Please rise and be acknowledged. You didn't hear me. Are there any state legislators in the audience? Please rise and be acknowledged for your presence and your interest. There's your call to action. You know what to do when you leave this room. Hook up with Liberty Chalkboard, follow Dr. Luksik, get on the phone with your state legislators, and turn them out if they're not listening to you. Now, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Luksik for questions. The other thing that I'll do is, I've been reminded 3 times now, typically at these gatherings, we rise and say a Pledge of Allegiance. It may feel a little bit difficult right now, but like I said, I've been requested to do this, and I'm going to ask the group from Liberty Chalkboard to please stand up, lead us in the pledge, and then we'll open up a question and answer period. So please. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
The way we'll do this, if you can stand up or raise your hand, you can ask me anything but my weight, which you can ask, but I won't tell you. If you could limit it to a question, you get 1 follow-up if you need it until I get the whole way around the room, because we always have limited time. I see a gentleman, and I don't know any of your names, so I'll be defining you by the color of your shirt. White shirt.
You had mentioned taking children out of public school. How is Common Core in charter, private, and parochial schools?
Okay, the question was, how is Common Core being implemented, if at all, in charter, private, and parochial schools? Charter schools are public schools.
Right.
So whatever is applicable to the regular public school up the street is also being implemented in the charter school because they are public schools, so they're mandated. Private and parochial schools, it's different from state to state. They have, in this state, they have a choice, so you would have to call the school to find out whether they're doing it or not doing it, because they do have a choice as to whether they are or are not. My understanding is that some of the Catholic dioceses are implementing it, and so you would then need to work with the diocese. Some of the schools are more or less compliant, but you would need to call each private school to find out. Glasses, yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, common core is supposed to be so devastating to our children. What is the alternative? What would we recommend to a school committee for our curriculum?
Okay, the question is, the Common Core seems to be devastating. What is the alternative? That's actually a very good question, and you hear it a lot. And the simple answer is there isn't one alternative, because all the children are different. So when you talk to your school committee, what you really want is for the school committee to be able to develop what works in their community or to offer options, which is, people say, well, how could you do that? That's what we did before the federal government took over. Like, you had multiple ways to get a high school diploma. You could take a business or an academic or an advanced. We used to acknowledge all of those things, and American education thrived. So, I'm old, as my children reminded me in the dinosaurs. So I was actually in classrooms before this happened, and amazingly enough, we managed to educate kids. So it isn't, like this idea that somehow if we don't have standards, well, what's the alternative? Let me explain standards to you this way. These are two of my children, so these are real stories. I have one daughter. She's a classical ballerina. In order for her to dance, I homeschooled her for high school because she was a professional at 17. So we're working through, and I gave her a time problem. How long does it take for? And she brought me a negative number as an answer. And I said, honey, that's wrong. And she said, why? I said, honey, time doesn't go backwards. What? Can you get younger? No, because time doesn't go backwards. What? She's a mathematical dyslexic. This is the girl that if she's in the grocery store and it says 2 ounces and she wants to double the recipe, she calls me and says, how much should I buy? Okay? She's very successful. She's a principal dancer. She's very successful. One of her brothers is an engineer. Some of them are engineers, but we're going to talk about this one. When he was in college, he was a double engineering major with a math minor, and in his last semester of his senior year, through a bureaucratic snafu, the college came and said, you need to take 23 more credits to graduate. So you're going to have to stay an extra semester. And he had a presidential scholarship, and he said, are you going to extend it? And they said, no. He said, well, then I'm taking all 23 credits. So he took 23 engineering and math credits in his second semester senior year. He made the dean's list. How do I write a math standard that's appropriate for both of those children? There's no such animal. It would either be too hard for her or too easy for him. And that is just 2 of my 6. Now imagine that times how many millions of children and how many millions of subjects. Saying that you can write a standard that is good for every child is like saying you believe in magic. It's not possible. So when we say what is the alternative is to free teachers to teach. Because they actually do know how. And if they're bad, you fire them. But most teachers are good, and most teachers care a lot. You know, I am one, I've been one for a long time, I'm married to one. And most of the folks I worked with, they really cared about the kids. So get the bureaucrats out. Allow schools to be schools and allow parents to be parents in control and allow teachers to be teachers. So the alternative is actual local control. The alternative isn't one size fits all. The alternative is actual local control. Understanding that you can't write one thing for every child. It's not possible. And it's the mindset we used to have. But somehow when we moved into standards, we moved into that's a manufacturing model. We're quality stamping children. In healthcare, do we set one standard for everybody? Does that mean there are no standards in healthcare? Of course not, there's tons of them. They just don't happen to be, every patient has to meet the same one. Education is more like healthcare than it is like manufacturing. And that's what you have to get across to people, is let the school committees design what works. Free them. Take the federal bureaucrats out of the picture. And what you'll see is a whole bunch of different things happening all over the country, which is what we used to have. And then people pick the school that works for their kid, which is also what we used to have. You know, there's an organization called the National American Adult Literacy. It's part of the U.S. Department of Education. And they started tracking levels of adult illiteracy from the 1870s, and they went all the way through, and they looked at graduates. And by 1979, adult illiteracy in America among high school graduates, not people who had just moved into the country, but people who had actually gotten a diploma, was less than 1%. And in 1979, the U.S. Department of Education was formed. And in 2013, that same organization now reports that adult illiteracy among American high school graduates is 19%. What happened? We took education out of the hands of the teachers and put it in the hands of bureaucrats so that we keep hamstringing the schools. So the alternative is to let the schools be schools and not a political football. That's really the alternative. Yes, ma'am, in the blue shirt.
Where do you stand on IEP plans? Because I personally think, although they're individualized, I think a lot of times they hold the child back or they're deterrent because they have that rigor, so they call it, set up for them. And then a lot of times I don't feel it advances the child, or that child is in a regular classroom setting. where the teacher isn't qualified for some of that, that they don't have enough structure in the school to have enough staff to handle this. And the teacher is having to divide her time between plans. And to me, if you're a good teacher, you can tell if a child has a dyslexic problem or this or that, and you can work with that. But since that's been a rigor across the board now, I think it's a detriment to some children rather than an enhancement to it. I'm wondering where you stand on that.
Okay, the question was, where do I stand on IEPs? That's the Individualized Education Plan. That's a special ed. It's interesting. One of the things I did in my life was when, that was a federal law, we called it 94-142 because it was the 94th Congress. I was one of the trainers in how to do IEPs in the Northwest Quadrant of the state of Pennsylvania, so I traveled all over teaching people how to do them. Originally, they were a really good idea because those kids just kind of stagnated, nobody paid any attention, and so it was, no, you have to give them the most that they can have in what was called the least restrictive environment. But like everything else that the federal government put its hands on, it's now more bureaucratic than it is interactive. And unfortunately with Common Core, the supports for those children are being withdrawn dramatically, and they're really being left to founder because they're being told you can't change the curriculum, you have to do the same curriculum. And so we're seeing, and that because the Common Core now requires so much money in remediation because of the tests, kids who actually have special needs are getting lost in the shuffle, which is sort of sad. There's better ways to, the original intent was good. As it got implemented, it got more and more rigid, and the kids kind of got lost in the shuffle. So now you see, I was just talking to somebody yesterday who, in the special ed classroom, were kids who had real special needs, but a child who didn't speak English. She didn't have a special need. She really should have been in a regular class, yeah. So that really was a good intentions that went amok, if that answers you. Yes, sir, Stanley.
In my research on the Common Core, I've come across articles where I've read that there's been a great diminishing, even an attack in the content of the social studies on the Judeo-Christian foundation of the nation, yet a promotion on Islam.
Yes.
How have you seen that?
Yes. In fact, it was reported in the Washington Times. It was an online curriculum that was used by many schools. It surfaced in Florida, where the children were told that the terrorists were people who had low self-esteem, and so they joined a terrorist group so that they would feel better about themselves. And that's why these poor people that went into the World Trade Center, they were just people who had low self-esteem. Caused kind of a ruckus in the town when the kids came home with that. So when the press went back and the school administrator said that's a Common Core curriculum and the teacher can't change it. In Texas, their version, they didn't take Race to the Top money, and they said they weren't doing Common Core, but they called it C-Scope, and the curriculum required they put 14-year-old girls in burqas. And the little ones were the girls were traumatized, and when the parents had a fit, the teachers said, we were told we weren't allowed to tell you in advance. The teachers weren't happy about it. In California, remember I told you the AP history standards where they don't mention the Holocaust or Hitler. So in the Common Core, it was an 8th grade Common Core classroom, and the kids were told that they were to debate whether or not the Holocaust existed. And so they were given writings by Islamic folks who said the Holocaust was political propaganda. Half the kids came to the conclusion that the Holocaust was pretend and didn't exist. And it was not until the B'nai B'rith, the Jewish Defense League, got actively involved that the school backed off of the curriculum. But it was originally a Common Core. In New York, in Common Core classrooms, the kids are being told that they have to memorize and recite the Islamic conversion prayer. In Tennessee, they were told that they were taught the 5 pillars of Islam, and when the parents complained, they were told, well, no, we're teaching world history, and the parents said, okay, where's Judaism? Or Christianity? Or Buddhism? Or Hinduism? The only one that was taught was Islam. Well, if it's world religions, there actually is more than one. But they only ever taught one, and they taught it as if it were true. So we are seeing an influx. One of the chains of charter schools is actually owned by a fellow from Turkey who is Islamic, and it's being promoted through his charter school network. So we are seeing that surface again and again. When it surfaces, it's always part of a Common Core curriculum, and then when it goes public, what you hear is first defense, and then, well, that's not really Common Core. But it's surfacing in the Common Core curriculums and in textbooks that say Common Core on them. So we are, across the country, that is surfacing again and again and again, which, you know, a reasonable person would say it's a pattern. Yes, sir, in the green shirt. The green, yes.
If I choose to educate my children outside of Common Core, what effect will there be if they want to apply to a state university or a community college? Will there be an effect because the state has aligned with the Common Core?
I got asked that about the SATs. If you teach a clean curriculum, your kids are going to ace the SATs because they'll be able to do all the math and obviously they'll know all the vocabulary. A lot of the, particularly private schools, are saying they won't even use the SAT anymore because it will be meaningless. So we're seeing a movement away from that. I'm actually in touch with a group they're in Texas and Tennessee. It's kind of a multi-state group that is working to develop an alternative that's clean to the SATs. So we are seeing a pushback, and I shouldn't say a lot, but a growing number of colleges are saying, we're just not. The state is pushing the state universities to use the Common Core testing as their entrance exams. But the private schools are saying, well, we won't do it. We're not doing it. So you're going to see divisions in the schools. The problem that arises is, remember Algebra 1 by the end of your sophomore year in high school. So everybody would have to go to a community college. So an engineering degree would take 6 years, because you'd have to make up that math before you could even start. So it's, you know, there's an economic impetus for the schools to keep kids in longer because they get more tuition. So it's, you're going to see a divide between the schools. Some of the schools that are of a religious bent, both Catholic and Protestant, and now there's some of the Jewish yeshivas and stuff are saying, we're just going to do something, we're going to hold firm. So you're going to see a big divide between. Yes, sir.
I'm holding in my hand a copy of the Constitution of the United States. I'd like to ask you what phrase, what clause, or what article authorizes our federal government to be involved in any of this?
None. None. You're exactly right. None. Yes, ma'am, in the red.
What we're talking here is the worker state. We also have new programs called STEM programs, which take the elites of children and give them special training for the advantage of the state. Can we not say communism here?
Many people agree with that, yes. Let me, and I will, it's so unbelievable, I'll actually show it to you. You're not the state that's the farthest ahead. Delaware is the farthest ahead. And I have helped the folks in Delaware. So let's see if I can get to Delaware.
Beautiful family.
Delaware is the farthest ahead, and in Delaware, because they got phase 1 money, so in Delaware, they've been assessing pre-kindergarten for a while, and they build the databases, and the kids, by the time they're in 8th grade, okay, why are you not making this come up? Oh, yeah, that is my family. There you go. All my boys. Why is this not coming up? All right. Hopefully it will. I'm looking at a screen. In Delaware, by the 8th grade, the students have to have what's called a student success plan, which is the state looks at all of the information that they've collected and they start aptitude testing the children. And the student success plan is they get a menu of these are the careers that are right for you. And then they pick one by 8th grade, and then your whole high school is geared toward your getting that career. Parents can look at their child's student success plan. They can't change it. They can only sign off that they saw it, which is, if I can, where's my technical person? I can't get the screen to come up, so if you can, I don't know what I'm doing here, because I'm looking at a screen.
Don't call me a technical person.
Well, there you go. You're better than me.
I study Common Core.
In computers, yes. So and in Georgia, it's the same, it's called a career matchmaker. The parents can maneuver among the things on the list, but they can't step outside. the list. So all of the databasing was used to determine what your career will be, and then you only get the education needed for that career. It's workforce development in its purest sense. So you're right. Yes, sir, in the back.
Where do the engineers and the scientists and people like that that require the calculus that is no longer being taught fit in?
What we're seeing begin to surface is based on all of all the things that are being developed demographically in the databasing, you will be selected to be allowed to take this course or that course. But right now, it's a leveling that's happening. You know, in the earliest grades, this is particularly devastating. For the littlest children, this is the hardest because it's so developmentally inappropriate that we're basically destroying their self-esteem. So in New York, they actually had she was a licensed clinical therapist who testified that she had little ones cutting themselves because of the stress of how developmentally inappropriate it was. Because their brains are not developed enough to do the critical thinking and to think abstractly. They don't think abstractly when they're little. They're concrete thinkers, and yet we're giving them abstract thoughts. But the other thing about little kids is, if I ask you something stupid, you would say, that was stupid thinking. But a little one, when a grown-up says something stupid and the little one can't do it, the little one can't evaluate the grown-up. So the little one says, I'm stupid. They internalize that if they can't do what the grown-up says, the fault's in them. They can't help it. That's the developmental stage. So right now what we're seeing at the youngest levels is this is particularly devastating for the little people because it's asking them to think in ways they can't think. There was a reason we taught math the way we taught it in classical education. Because little ones, their minds are concrete, they're like little sponges. So you give them a fact and they just swallow it. And what do little people want to be more than anything else? Big people. And how do they know they're big? They know stuff. That's what makes them big. So when they knew all of the math facts, they were successful, they felt good, that was self-esteem, they could do it, and they were big. We also did it to make things automatic. So if I'm having a conversation and I say, what time is it? What do? You glance at your watch, a time pops in your head, but your conversation doesn't stop. You know you did 7 things? I know that I've taught people how to tell time. It's 7 things that you did. When the first time I taught how to teach how to tell time, I was like, wow, this is really complicated. I didn't realize there was this many steps. But we so internalize them that your mind does it it's just automatic. Well, that's why we teach you to memorize, or used to, addition facts and multiplication facts. So by the time you got to calculus and you were trying to reduce a fraction or find a limit, and you saw 7 times 8, 56 popped in your head. Could you imagine if you had to stop and draw 7 rows of 8 sticks every single time? But that's what our kids are having to do. You wanted it to be automatic, so they don't think about it. So that they're able then, as they get older, to do the more abstract and complex things because the other ones are automated in their heads. That's why we taught it that way. There were reasons for it. But when we removed that, the first thing that they do then is they make common children. Because none of the little ones can excel. If I give all of you something that none of you can do, then you're all equally bad. So nobody can excel. So they start by making common children. And then we use the demographics to determine who will be allowed to excel. So it's a really kind of well thought out plan all the way along. It's just really ugly. Yes, ma'am?
I just have a question. My daughter's a junior in high school and she's been interested in becoming a teacher. Well, now the government is sort of taking control of all of this. Do you encourage her to become a teacher in a college that is now going to be Common Core taught, and then she's going to have to teach it and all of that?
I will. She has a daughter who is interested in becoming a teacher. She's a junior in high school, so our children of that age, do we encourage them to become teachers? You know, I hate to say no because teaching is, like, if you're supposed to be one, you're really supposed to be one. But shop carefully. Find a college that is as clean as you can make it. And there are some out there that are not compliant. So shop carefully is what I would tell you. If you are a teacher in a classroom, stay as long as you can stand it. Make them fire you. You know, protect the children in your care as long as you can. which is that's hard for the teachers right now. They're stuck in the middle. But as long as you can stand it and stay. They'll shop your colleges.
What happened to school boards?
Well, right now they're still there, but in the plans moving forward, which is why you're seeing such a push toward charter schools, because there are no school boards. And the plan is to eliminate. What happened in education, remember I told you we fought this in the 90s and all people fought back and people got elected to school boards across the country and started pushing back because it's the most local level and so an average citizen can affect it. So we're seeing a move away from regular school districts as we know them into charter schools where teachers are paid directly by the state is actually the plan. And so the local community just writes the contract. And the charters, for example, in New Orleans, they don't have any more public schools. They're all charter schools. And they are not held to the same standards, and they are taught by what are called Teach for America volunteers. Those are people who get 5 weeks of training, and if they stay for 2 years, they either get student loans forgiven or college tuition paid. So the kids in the inner cities who most need the most experienced teachers are getting the least. 5 weeks does not a teacher make, and they're just reading the curriculum. So it's the school boards are a problem because the citizens can have an impact there. And across the country, we're seeing a move toward charter schools. I will take 2 more questions and then we're going to go. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you can confirm a theory that I've kind of developed tonight by watching the information. It's been talked about workforce and even welfare state has been mentioned. And it seems like the children are not the object of the best interest of this curriculum. But when they're developing all kind of information, again, the workforce, all the way up to 4 years postgraduate, all the way down the line, they want to determine everything about their attitude. Can they use this statistical data, or is there a plan to determine what the possible income earning potential is, get a mean average, and determine tax policy later on the amount of income for the federal government? Is that a possibility?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Dovetail off of what this woman said up here about her daughter going into education. I took my daughter out of public school and sent her to a parochial school in Hingham. She is now a sophomore at Bridgewater State University going for elementary education. And I want to cry because she comes home every day, she excelled in math, and she says that she can't do it, it's impossible, and she wants to get out of going forward with teaching elementary education. So my question to you, doctor, is if my daughter, who excelled in math at a parochial school, can't follow this, how are teachers right now that are using our kids as guinea pigs, in my opinion, being educated on this new type of math, and are they being tested before they're able to go forward and teach these kids that are in the school systems right now?
That's a good question. They are not being tested, but what is happening is, and this is from teachers, they're being handed a script when they go into the classrooms. This is how you say it, this is how you teach it, and they're being handed a script to follow, that you do it this way. So the teachers who've been at it for years are saying, I was in Philadelphia, I didn't realize I was in a room full of Philadelphia public school teachers until I was done, and then they like mobbed me, and I thought, oh, okay. They were crying with like tears, saying we're quitting as fast as we can. Every morning we're handed a script and we all have to follow it. So, and I'm in other states, I hear that all the time. We're being handed a script. So the teachers, I mean, there are training in Common Core happening all over. I've attended a bunch of them. They're interesting. Not particularly helpful, but mostly it's scripted. And the move to Teach for America volunteers, they don't know anything but to follow the script. So they just read the script that they're told to follow. And because they don't have the background, when I was in Tennessee, a young teacher decided to challenge me. He was adorable. And he stood up and he said, well, no, see, I have these lovely children and they don't really know how to do it, so I scaffold everything. Now, scaffold. You know like a window washer? You build the scaffold outside the building? Well, educational scaffolding, if you keep that in your head, so they can't really read the story. So before you read, I'm going to say, these are all the characters. Here's the vocabulary. I'm going to stop you after every sentence and paraphrase it. This is what I want you to think about. That's scaffolding, because they can't really do it, because he said, well, these little ones can't really, this is the class, they can't really do it, but I just scaffold them. And so we get them through it with scaffolding. And I said, so when do you remove the scaffold? Or do you plan to become surgically attached at the hip to these children for the rest of their lives, so you're constantly scaffolding? Well, I'll tell you when they remove the scaffold, when they take the state assessment. And then they can't do it. And so you have this enormous, all of a sudden, stressed out, disastrous situation because the kid, if their real achievement was never addressed. The whole purpose of education is so you can do it without the scaffold. Like, you know, when I taught little ones, and you know, you'd always have like a slow one and one of the brighter ones didn't want to wait, so they jumped in and give the answer, and I would say, are you going to become surgically attached to their hip? That was really nice. Are you going to answer his questions forever? And they would laugh, and then they would say that to each other. But then the slower ones realized, yeah, if I sit here and wait, we're all going to wait for 20 minutes because nobody's going to help me. And they figured it out. But this system hides non-achievement with all this scaffolding, and so nobody knows they can't do it until they can't do it, either because they take the state assessment, which is most common, or real life happens, you know, and they can't do it. So it's a really ugly process all the way along, and the teachers, there's not a way to train somebody to do it wrong when the kids can't do it. So they just read the script, and then everybody fails. So it's really frustrating. Your daughter probably is fine in math. Look for a different college. I mean, that's my best advice to you. Look for a different school.
She asked me if she's afraid to ask the teachers, so if there's any teachers in the audience, or if you may know this answer, is if the teacher right now teaches the old way, because I'm assuming the test is the end result, will the teacher be penalized?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, sir, and this will be the last one.
Listen to everything you said today, and it's very profound. I agree totally with you. But I have one last question. Is what we're looking at here, and is what America is uprising about on both parties and all, you know, every political affiliation, something that Americans are fighting against is on this. Is this the same thing that our fathers and grandfathers fought against in World War II, in Korea, against the North Vietnamese, against the Chinese, in the Cold War? Is this a Soviet system we're looking at here?
Yes.
State control?
It is that system. And yeah, you're exactly right. And it's kind of funny, one of my kids is actually in the Navy, and so I couldn't really look him in the face if I didn't do this, could I? So, thank you so much for coming. Have a lovely evening.